Hi there, Alison here with another Cap Franc du jour. Today we are in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne and we're looking at the Yannick Guéméreau 2020 Les Magasins and Fort Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne. Domaine Yannick Guéméreau is one of the elite producers in the Bourgogne and Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne appellations. Today, Yannick and his son Benoit are continuing the work that Yannick's grandfather started back in the 1930s. When Eugène Guéméreau set up his domain in 1936, it was a polyculture estate, which was a very Ligérien thing to do. So along with his parcels here at Les Magasins, he also had fruit trees, asparagus, and some livestock as well. Yannick was greatly influenced by his grandfather's philosophy as it relates to viticulture and working the land respectfully and holistically. And when Yannick went out on his own in 1977, it didn't take him long to abandon chemical and synthetic treatments and work towards organics in the vineyard, as well as a very traditional approach in the cellar. Today, the domain is around 20 hectares of vines in both Bourgogne and Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne, but it was Les Magasins that started it all. Eugène planted his first vines here in 1936, and his first bottling from this jeudi was in 1947. And when Yannick went out on his own, he too began with these same parcels of vines in Les Magasins that belonged to his grandfather, and then he slowly built the domaine from there. So there's a few things that distinguish the Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne appellation from the Bourgogne appellation as it relates to their terroirs. And what I want to focus on today has to do with the vineyard area and the soils. So just past the commune of Bourgogne, the Loire River takes a little bit of a dogleg, and the ancient alluvial terrace that we find in the Bourgogne AOP actually gets a little bit wider here in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne. And this ancient alluvial terrace accounts for around 65% of the vineyard area in the appellation. And as this terrace widens, the area where we find vineyards on the recent alluvial soils and the area of vineyards that is on the côte or the slopes, that is where we find the Tronian tuffeau chalk-derived soils, these two areas narrow quite a bit. And while there is a lot to talk about as it relates to these ancient alluvial soils, I will leave that for another video. And today I want to focus on the côte or the slopes because that is where Les Magasins is located. So what do we need to know about the côte or the slopes in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne? Well, as I mentioned, they are a little bit more narrow, and they actually narrow further as you move east to west in the appellation. So in the eastern part of the appellation, we are just a few hundred meters away from the outer border, the western border of the Bourgogne AOP. And here, the slope in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne is at its widest point, around 500 meters. And then as you move west and you get just past the hamlet of La Gardière, the slope is only around 200 meters wide. And at elevations of around 60 to 70 meters above sea level, this is where we find the Tronian tuffeau chalk-derived soils. And here in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne, we only have the middle Turonian tuffeau chalk, and this is a glauconitic micaceous chalk. Whereas in Bourgogne, we have both the middle Turonian tuffeau as well as the upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk. Finally, as it relates to topsoils on the slopes in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne, the topsoils here are actually dominated by more sandy and silty sandy textures, whereas in Bourgogne we tend to find a lot more clay there. So honing in on Les Magasins a little bit further. This jeudi is a fair size, it's about 14 hectares, and from all accounts, this is one of the top premier cru level sites in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne. And from what I can tell, this is for good reason. We are in a very special part of the Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne appellation. We're on the slopes, as I said, and we are in the far eastern part of the appellation. Les Magasins is located only about 350 meters just past the western border of the Bourgogne AOP. And we are on a full south-facing exposure here, and we are at the widest point of the slopes in Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgogne. And here we are on that middle Turonian tuffeau chalk. And in terms of topsoil, uniquely here in Les Magasins, we actually have a little bit more clay in the topsoil as well. Now, honing in even further on the parcels that Yannick Guéméreau has here, they have 3 hectares, and they've actually divided this into 2 distinct plots. And the plot of about 2 hectares they've allocated to the single jeudi bottling of Les Magasins. And actually, when they're doing the harvesting, they do an even more precise selection from these 2 hectares. So in most vintages, the bottling of Les Maguins will actually be only coming from around 1 to 1.5 hectares of vines. Now, in terms of this block, it's in the upper portion of the vineyard. We're in the middle of the slope. We are on the Middeltronian tuffeau chalk, and there is a little bit more clay in the parcels as well. And in terms of vine plantings, the first planting here, as I said, was in 1936, and then they had subsequent plantings in 1973, 1980, and 1998. As it relates to the winemaking for this wine, as you may have noticed from the label, this is the amphore bottling of Les Maguins. And in some vintages, Benoit will do 2 bottlings from Les Maguins. He will do one that he refers to as classique and one that is the amphore bottling. And the winemaking for these 2 wines is exactly the same up until the time of bottling. So the winemaking is, it starts with hand-harvested fruit that is all destemmed. The fruit is left whole berry, and the fermentation is done with indigenous yeast in conical wooden vats. And then the maceration on skins is around 3 or so weeks. And Benoit will do some light punch downs in the beginning, and then he'll switch to lighter pump overs after that. And once the post-fermentation, maceration is complete, the wine will then be drained off its skins. And there's actually no press wine in this cuvee. In terms of aging, the aging is quite brief for this wine because Benoit wants to really retain the freshness and the purity of the fruit. So the aging is for around 12 months, and it's in a combination of 1/3 oak barrels, half of which is new, 1/3 conical wooden vats, and 1/3 amphora. And then in most vintages, when it comes time for bottling, Benoit will taste through the different amphora, and he will then make a selection that he will bottle individually as the Maguin Amphore cuvée. But in 2020, there's something unique about this wine. So Benoit shared with me that when they were harvesting from the Maguin parcels, this block of vines, it was 5 rows. These are the youngest vines that were planted in 1998. The fruit that was coming off this block was so superb in quality that they actually decided to isolate this fruit and do a completely separate vinification and élevage. So for this wine, the winemaking was all the same, but this wine, the 2020 vintage of the Les Maguins Amphore, is aged exclusively in amphora. So without further ado, let's get into the wine. So this wine has a really lovely perfume, very fragrant on the nose. And what leaps out of the glass first is blue. Lots of blue here. I'm getting wild blueberries, but it's like fresh blueberries as well as like a little bit of a blueberry compote thing as well. There's also some red fruits in here too, like a bit of wild strawberry. And I do like the herbal undertones with this wine. The pyrazines are nicely in balance with the fruit, and they're coming through for me as like soft herbs like basil, a little bit of tarragon. There's even like a little bit of a black currant leaf thing going on here as well. But really in general, the nose is quite pure fruited, very fresh, very fragrant. There's actually, speaking of fragrance, there's a little bit of a floral note on the nose as well. It's like a sweet purple flower note, like lilacs. On the palate, those same fruits come through bang on as they did on the nose. There's a little bit more underlying savoriness on the palate, which I really like. There's a bit more of a cedar thing happening on the palate, which is nice. And then that spice comes through. And for me, comes through like a bit more of a black pepper note. So the acidity of this wine, super lively, really persistent as well. And that works really nicely with the texture of the tannins. The tannins are very silky in the mouth. I would say about medium tannins here, but they have a firm texture on the finish. So you do feel like there's some nice structure here, that this wine was really built for some longer term aging. The wine has a lot of concentration and depth and layers, but at the same time, there's quite a bit of restraint here. It's a medium-bodied wine. This isn't a powerful wine. I would say that this is something that is a bit more graceful and finesse-driven, which I really quite like. Yeah, Another thing to note about this wine is because of the vintage, it was a warmer vintage, there's a real generosity to the fruit, a plushness to the fruit, which makes this wine really quite pleasurable, even though it is really quite on the younger side. And I think that's a good thing, because this is delicious to drink now, but I think it has someplace special to go to. Like, I think even in just 5 years' time, this is going to do wonders for this wine, and some of those additional tertiary layers are going to come through, and all of those extra elements that we love with older styles or older examples of Cabernet Franc. But this wine is really special. You sense that there's focus here, there's some poise, there's seriousness as well, but there's still a good amount of juiciness and freshness and plushness to the fruit profile, which make it really enjoyable now. But as I said, I think it can age even further. When I was in the Loire recently, I had a chance to visit the Les Magasins parcels with Benoit, and it was really an emotional experience for me, you know, to see the first block that Eugène planted in 1936, and you see these old gnarly vines, and it's an emotional experience. You know, you can't help but reflect on, you know, what was happening in the world during that time and what was going through Eugène's head when he was setting up his domaine. And you know, of all the wines that Yannick Emirault makes, this is really one of the cuvées, or the cuvée, I think, that is probably the most significant for the family, because this is where it all started. And this is a wine that I would definitely recommend people seek out, because if nothing else, for the emotional aspect of it, and thinking of the origin stories of this superb domaine. But really, it's such a great example of Cabernet Franc from Saint-Nicolas de Bourgogne, but really in general. If you've had this wine before, or if you have another favorite wine from Domaine Yannick Emirault, do let me know what it is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.